The year was 1884, and the small coastal town of Widow's Peak sat beneath a sky that never seemed entirely blue. The sea beyond the jagged cliffs groaned like an old creature, its slow rhythm marking the passage of time for the people who had learned to live at the edge of sorrow and salt. Widow's Peak was not a place one stumbled upon. It was the kind of town one either inherited or endured. Every shutter, every brick had a story. But there was one name uttered more quietly than the rest: Clara Whitby, the child who made the town remember laughter in the most tragic way. The story began on a morning too quiet for its own good. The mist rolled down from the woodlands, swallowing the cobblestone streets and blurring the church steeple that overlooked the harbour. Fishermen had delayed casting their nets. Even the blacksmith's forge was silent. In that pause between dawn and daylight, a glimmer of sound broke the fog, a child's laugh, high and bright, rippling through the chill. The sound came from the old Whitby house, perched near the cliff's edge, where ivy crawled over its windows like the slow fingers of time. Clara was 7, a girl of narrow bones and vivid eyes that seemed to catch every flicker of light. Her mother, Martha Whitby, rarely spoke. Since her husband's passing during a storm 5 winters ago, her voice had retreated into whispers and prayer. Yet even in her grief, Martha found herself both soothed and unnerved by her daughter's laughter. It wasn't that Clara laughed too often. It was that she laughed at moments no one else would. When the sky thundered, when dogs barked at the dark, when the waves hissed against the cliffs, she would tilt her head and let out that lilting sound. It never echoed for long. It always seemed to die just before reaching the wind. The townsfolk had their theories, as small towns always do. Some said grief had wounded the child's sense of fear. Others whispered that the sea, jealous of the husband it had taken, wanted the daughter too. But none said it aloud when Martha passed by, shoulders squared, eyes lost in distance. Only the Reverend Doyle, a man more burdened by empathy than conviction, dared to visit her now and then, finding excuses to bring bread or hymn sheets she didn't need. He looked at Clara and saw nothing evil, only an innocence that faced the world without blinking. One afternoon, the Reverend stood watching Clara play near the cliff, chasing the coloured ribbons her mother had tied to a wooden stick. The fog had begun to lift, revealing the expanse of ocean like a sheet of tarnished silver. "You shouldn't play so close to the edge, Clara," he said gently. She laughed again, twirling the stick, her curls glinting in the soft light. "The sea doesn't scare me, Reverend. It laughs too. Listen." The man frowned. The surf crashed below, restless and cold, but to her it was melody. He almost envied her perception, her refusal to let sorrow harden her. But as he turned to go, he caught sight of Martha in the window, watching not her daughter but the horizon. Her face was expressionless, yet her knuckles were white against the sill. That evening, when he returned to the vicarage, Doyle wrote a small note in his journal. "The child smiles at the void. Her mother fears it. I wonder which is right." Night came early in Widow's Peak, and the lamps flickered weakly in the salt-bitten wind. Inside the Whitby home, Martha sewed by the fire while Clara hummed softly beside her, arranging seashells in neat lines along the floor. The crackling fire cast their shadows against the wall, one tall, stiff and angular, the other restless, flickering, almost dancing. Martha's hand trembled over her stitching. "Clara," she said, not looking up, "where did you go today?" "To the cliffs," the girl murmured. "I wanted to see the ocean laugh." Martha's jaw tightened. "You mustn't go alone. Do you understand? The sea doesn't love as people do." Clara looked up, puzzled. "But Papa's there, isn't he? That's why it laughs when I do." Silence pressed between them. Martha's needle paused mid-air. For a long time the only sound was the fire sighing, and a faint drip of water from somewhere deeper in the house. It was not raining, yet the sound persisted rhythmically from the direction of the doorway. When Martha rose to check, she found the front steps wet, though the skies were clear. She said nothing, only drew the bolt tight and added another log to the fire. Outside, beneath the slivered moon, something moved along the path from the cliffs, a shape too small for a man, but too deliberate for the wind. The hounds in the neighbouring yard began to whine low, their paws scratching against the door. The next morning the town awoke to a strange calm. The sea was flat, the sky pale as bone. Martha did not appear at the market as she always did. By noon Doyle made his way to the Whitby house again, uneasy with the hush that wrapped around it. He knocked once, twice, no answer. When he finally pushed the door open, the house felt colder than the street outside. The fireplace was ashes. The shell pattern on the floor was gone. He found Martha by the kitchen table, her hands clasped around a mug gone cold. Her eyes, hollowed yet steady, lifted to meet his. "She's gone," she said plainly. Doyle glanced around. "Clara? Gone where?" Martha's lips trembled before setting firm. The sea took her. Last night. He wanted to believe she meant she had run off, that perhaps she'd gone chasing her laughter through the mist. But there was a resignation in Martha's voice that carried no hope. He searched the cliffs for hours with 2 fishermen, calling until their voices cracked. They found nothing. No footprints, no ribbon, no mark of fall. Only the sound of waves licking the stones far below. That night, Martha sat again by the fire that refused to warm her. Every creak of the floor made her flinch. When another gust rattled the shutters, she pressed her palms to her ears, trying not to hear what lingered beyond. The faintest ripple of a child's laugh carried somewhere deep in the wind, as if the cliff itself remembered her. Reverend Doyle returned after dark, determined to keep her company. He spoke in soft tones, quoting lines of scripture neither of them truly believed. "Perhaps she found peace," he muttered. "Perhaps some things aren't meant for us to—" Martha cut him short with a look so resolute it chilled him. She was mine. And the sea had no right. The fire cracked sharply. Outside, the wind swelled again, carrying a scent of brine into the room. Martha looked toward the window and whispered something Doyle couldn't catch. He leaned closer, but her gaze was distant, following some invisible thread into the night. When the flame dimmed, he thought he heard a sound, a faint, mirthful note, like a child caught between a giggle and a sigh. He said nothing, afraid the moment he acknowledged it, it might grow louder. By morning, Martha Whitby was gone too. The town searched for days, but all they found was her shawl tangled in the rocks below the cliff, heavy with seawater. The Reverend stood above the ledge, eyes red from sleeplessness, and listened. The sea was quiet, almost kind. Only once, as he turned to leave, he thought he heard it again. That soft, unearthly laugh threading through the waves, sweet and distant. It was the kind of sound one could almost mistake for memory. Reverend Doyle could not leave Widow's Peak, even when every instinct told him to go. The loss of the Whitby women had stirred something heavier than grief. It was a silence that pressed on the town like a fog that refused to lift. Weeks passed, and though his sermons grew shorter, the pews grew emptier. People preferred whispers to worship. When he visited the harbor, fishermen turned their eyes away. Only old Captain Lorne dared to speak to him. "So you keep chasing ghosts, Reverend," Lorne muttered one dawn. "But the sea doesn't give them back. It swallows them whole." Doyle said nothing. He only watched the waves gnawing at the shore. Still, something in him refused to believe Clara and her mother had simply vanished. The sea, vast as it was, always left something behind. A shoe, a thread of cloth, a body. But not this time. One grey afternoon, while sorting through the church's storeroom, he found a small object tucked between hymnals, a seashell, smooth and pearly, tied with a piece of red ribbon. His pulse quickened. He remembered Clara's shells, the same ones she'd arranged beside the fire. The discovery felt deliberate, as if placed there for him to find. He turned it over, half expecting to see her initials carved into it. Instead, he found faint etchings, a cross, and beneath it a small curve like a smile. That night, Doyle lit every candle in the church and placed the shell at the pulpit. The flame's glow trembled across the stained glass, bending the face of the Virgin into something mournful. "If there is mercy," he whispered, "let it rest here." But the wind outside rose suddenly, battering the windows with such force that some of the candles went out. The sea's distant roar grew louder, closer, as if creeping up the hillside. The sound was a rhythm now, an uneven, breathing pulse. And for a moment, Doyle thought he heard that other sound again, the child's laugh, faint but unmistakable. By morning, the storm had passed. The townsfolk said nothing about the thunder or the wind, but the Reverend's church smelled of salt, and when he checked the pulpit, the seashell was gone. Days became weeks, and the air shifted toward winter. Widow's Peak was never kind in the cold. The ocean froze at its edges, and the gulls vanished inland. Doyle took to walking to the cliffs every evening, his lantern swinging beside him. He always stopped near the spot where Clara was last seen, where the rocks dropped steeply into the sea. The grass there had withered in an unnatural pattern, a hollow circle, darker than the soil around it. He would kneel, whisper a prayer, and wait, not for a miracle, but for understanding. On the 13th night he noticed footprints in the frost, small ones, narrow and bare, leading from the hillside toward the water. They were fresh. His breath caught, crystallizing in the night air. He followed them, each step bringing him closer to the cliff. But before he reached the edge, they stopped abruptly, where the ground crumbled into emptiness. There was no sign of disturbance, no struggle, just the faint sound of the tide striking below. He knelt again, lantern flickering against his boots, and whispered, "Clara?" The wind shifted. It carried the faintest echo, half whisper, half laughter, and for the briefest second he saw movement in the mist. A small silhouette turned away, hair lifting in the wind. He rose, heart thundering. "Clara!" he shouted, but the shape dissolved with the fog, leaving nothing but sea spray glinting like tiny shards of glass. When Doyle returned to his quarters, he could not sleep. The image replayed again and again. He remembered Clara's ribbon, her laughter, her mother's silence. He thought of the sea laughing with her, mocking them all. In his journal, he wrote a single line before closing it. "The innocent do not return the same." The following morning, he went to see Captain Lorne again. The old man was mending nets on the dock, his fingers thick with age. Doyle recounted what he had seen. Lorne's eyes narrowed. "You saw the child," he said, not as a question but as a grim acknowledgement. "There's something about this coast. The ones taken by it, they don't rest. The tide remembers their names. You believe me then?" "I believe the sea doesn't forget," the captain replied, tying another knot. "But don't listen when it tries to speak. That's how it keeps you." Doyle walked away, but the words clung to him. That night, when he lit his lamp again, he caught his own reflection in the glass. For a fleeting instant behind his reflection, another faint figure stood near the back of the church, small, pale, and unmoving. When he turned, it was gone. The days that followed blurred together in a strange haze of sleeplessness and doubt. Reverend Doyle carried on with his duties, but his sermons faltered. His words stuttered where faith once flowed smoothly. People noticed. They whispered that grief had cracked him, that he was haunted by what he couldn't save. Some even avoided him entirely, crossing themselves when he passed in the street. Yet despite their unease, Doyle could not escape the feeling that Clara's story was not finished. There were nights when he woke to the sound of gulls crying, only to realize they were silent, and the voice came from neither sky nor dream, but from inside the walls of the church itself. It began subtly, a faint giggle echoing after the evening bells, then the creak of pews shifting when no one sat upon them. Once, while locking the door after sunset, he caught sight of something in the corridor. A small shadow stretched impossibly long, sliding across the worn floorboards toward the altar. When he approached, there was nothing, only the faint scent of salt water lingering in the air. He told himself that exhaustion was twisting his senses, that the sea's endless voice could trick the mind into hearing anything. Still, he wrote about each occurrence in his journal, carefully dating and describing them. He was methodical, as if accumulation might somehow turn madness into revelation. One cold evening, he decided to confront his own fears. He brought a lantern, a Bible, and the same tin cross that Martha Whitby had gifted the church before Clara's birth. As rain pinned itself against the windows, Doyle took the cross in both hands and knelt in front of the altar. "If this is grief," he whispered, "let me bear it. But if it is more, show me what remains." The wind rose with a low moan, circling the building as if it had found a voice of its own. He waited, his heart leaping each time the door rattled. Then softly from the far end of the nave came that sound. High, bright, unmistakable. A child's laugh. It was not cruel or mocking. It was pure, uncomplicated joy, echoing in the hollow air until it dissolved somewhere beneath the rafters. Doyle's breath trembled. "Clara," he called. "Is that you?" The laugh came again, closer this time. He turned, lantern shaking, and saw movement near the pews, light catching on wet footprints that hadn't been there before. They trailed slowly toward him, each print glimmering faintly as though freshly made. Fear clawed at his throat, but curiosity anchored him. He leaned down, touching the nearest print. It was cold yet solid, and as he touched it, the sound of waves filled the silence, not outside but within the church walls. The scent of salt grew stronger. When he rose again, the lantern flickered violently, and for an instant he swore he saw her, the small figure of a child standing by the altar, her hair plastered to her cheeks, her smile too gentle to be imagined. He froze. "Clara," he whispered again, but the figure tilted its head, not in recognition but curiosity. Then the light faltered, and when it steadied, the space was empty. Only the sound of retreating footsteps remained, each softer than the last until it blended back into silence. When dawn arrived, Doyle found himself still kneeling, the lantern cold beside him. The footprints had vanished. He left the church and walked straight to Captain Lorne's cottage by the docks. The old fisherman answered with a weary expression. "I told you not to listen," he said before Doyle could even speak. "It's clever, Reverend. It knows your sorrow and it uses it." "I saw her," Doyle said. "Or something that wore her shape." Lorne frowned, rubbing at his chin. "The sea doesn't take without purpose. When it calls back the living, it's because someone still owes it something." "Then what does it want from me?" Doyle asked. "Perhaps not you," the captain murmured. "Perhaps it wants remembrance. You keep her alive in your prayers. That keeps its voice strong." Doyle left unsettled. The sea had never frightened him before, but now he could not stand the sound of it. He avoided the cliffs altogether, preaching only when necessary. Yet his dreams betrayed him. He dreamt of Clara walking along the tide line, her laughter blending with the waves, her eyes too knowing for a child's. In those dreams, she would stop and look back at him, as if waiting for him to follow. And one night, he did. The wind had turned harsher by late January. The shoreline was embedded with shards of ice, and the horizon looked carved from slate. Doyle wrapped a wool coat around his shoulders and carried a lantern down the path to Widow's Peak. The cliffs were silent except for the faint hiss of wind between the rocks. He stood there for a long time, staring into the black waters below. The tide was rising, churning heavy foam against the base of the bluff. Then there it was again, the laugh. But this time it wasn't distant. It came from beneath, from the hollow beneath the cliff where the sea carved small caves. He leaned forward, holding his lantern high. Something gleamed within the surf just for a second, before slipping under again. He staggered back, heart pounding. The wind knocked the lantern from his hand, and the flame went out, swallowed by the dark. He sank to his knees, gripping the cold ground. "What are you?" He gasped into the storm. "What do you want?" The only reply was another laugh, soft, distant, endlessly familiar. It rose from below and faded into the roar of the sea. No words, no answers. Only that tender sound repeating into the night, like a memory that refused to die. By February, Widow's Peak had taken on an air of collective dread. The storm struck harder and more frequently that year, breaking masts in the harbor and pulling nets clean away from the boats that dared to go out. The fishermen whispered that the sea was claiming debts left unpaid. To them it wasn't merely bad weather, it was punishment. And always behind their murmurs lingered the name of Reverend Doyle, whispered as though speaking it might invite the same misfortune that followed him. He had changed. The townsfolk saw it in his gait, in his eyes, a man stretched thin by something invisible. He walked each morning with a lantern, even in daylight, as though the world had turned too dim to trust. There were times he could be found standing at the church door in the middle of the night, muttering prayers that no longer resembled faith. The sound of a child's laughter had taken up residence in his mind. It threaded through his every waking hour, soft as the tide but impossible to escape. The night after his encounter by the cliffs, Doyle began writing long letters to himself. Each one began the same. To whoever finds this. He described his sightings, the voices, the footprints that never remained until sunrise. But with every letter his language softened, bled into memory. He wrote about Clara's smile, about Martha's grief and how silence seemed heavier in houses that had lost laughter. One evening, as he finished another letter, he noticed a faint pattern blooming along the paper's edge, tiny, uneven drops of water. His hands were dry, the windows shut. The ink bled outward like veins through the page. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, it brought strange dreams. In one, Doyle saw the sea rise higher than the cliffs, folding over the church spire as if reclaiming something stolen. Beneath the water, Clara danced, her ribbons fluttering like seaweed. She wasn't drowning nor alive, only suspended, smiling, waiting. "You hear it too," she whispered, voice warm through the cold depths. "The sea wants you to listen." He woke, gasping. Water pooled at the edge of his bed, but when he lit the lamp, the floorboards were dry. The next day he walked the length of Widow's Peak without speaking to anyone. He stopped at the church and opened every window, letting the cold sweep through until the candle flames bent low. It felt like cleansing, or surrender. Captain Lorne found him later that day sitting by the cliffs again. "How you keep chasing echoes?" Lorne said, resting a hand on his shoulder. "The girl's gone, Reverend. Some things you can't pull back." Doyle didn't look at him. "You ever loved something the sea took?" "Every day," the old man replied softly. "But I learned not to call its name again." Doyle's gaze stayed on the horizon. "She's still calling." The captain sighed, lowered himself beside him. "Then pray she doesn't stop." For several days after that, Widow's Peak went eerily still. No wind, no gulls, no storms. The calm felt wrong. Fishermen stayed ashore despite the clear weather, unwilling to tempt what quiet might be hiding. Doyle took the opportunity to walk north, to the marsh beyond the cliffs where the river met the tide. Few ever went there. It was shallow, tangled in reeds, the ground soft enough to swallow boots whole. Yet there he found what he hadn't dared hope for, the ribbon. Red, frayed and caught between two stones. It might have been anyone's, but he knew. The knot was Martha's stitching, uneven and hurried. He pulled it free and sat in the mud, clutching it so tightly that his hands ached. And faintly from the water's edge a laugh rose again, not distant this time, but near enough that it brushed his ear. He turned quickly, heart hammering, only to find the marsh empty. As he walked home, the sky began to darken, though the sun had not set. Fog rolled in from the sea, thick and pale, dimming the lamps before they could be lit. The streets emptied. By the time he reached the church, the mist had swallowed half the town. He climbed the steps, ribbon still clutched in hand, and pushed open the heavy doors. Inside, the air was heavy, wet with salt. The candles near the altar flickered weakly as if suffocating. On the pulpit lay a seashell, larger than before, polished by rough waves. He hadn't placed it there. Kneeling, Doyle stared at it in silence. "If this is your will," he said quietly, "let me understand." The sound came again from behind him, soft laughter, high and sharp, cutting through the stillness. He turned, and this time the figure did not vanish. Clara stood at the far end of the aisle, eyes dark like deep water, her dress clinging to her frame with moisture that never dripped. "You kept listening," she said, her voice too calm for the chill it carried. "Now you can hear what the others can't." Doyle rose slowly. "What are you?" "I am what they remember," she replied. "And what you called back." He took a step forward, then another, until the air between them wavered like heat over fire. "Did the sea send you?" She tilted her head. "The sea gave me a voice, but you gave me meaning." He hesitated, torn between awe and terror. "What do you want?" Her expression softened, and all at once she seemed less ghost than child again. Her small shoulders hunched, her hands clasped before her. "Only to be heard," she said. "To not be forgotten beneath the waves." Doyle reached out a trembling hand, but before he could touch her, the light extinguished. Darkness poured through the church like rising water. When he blinked, she was gone. The seashell still glimmered faintly on the altar, glistening with droplets that hadn't been there before. For a long while the Reverend stood motionless. Then, slowly, he picked up the shell and pressed it to his ear. The distant rush of surf filled the hollow space inside. Beneath it, faint but unmistakable, was laughter, echoing, eternal, patient. Doyle did not open the church doors for 3 days. He remained inside, praying and writing, the shell always near his hand. Every hour he pressed it to his ear, expecting silence, but the laughter persisted, melodic, soft, never mocking. It was as though Clara were waiting, suspended somewhere between air and tide. He felt less terror now and more obligation. The church had become her keepsake, and he its reluctant keeper. Outside, the fog continued its siege. The townspeople saw the mist as an omen, and kept to their homes, curtains drawn, hearts pounding when they heard the faint knocks echoing through empty streets at night. Some claimed they saw figures along the cliffs, silhouettes standing at the edge, gazing into nothing. A few swore the sea had turned calmer, unnaturally so, like a vast lung holding its breath. On the 4th morning, Doyle stepped outside with the shell in hand and looked toward the cliffs. The air felt alive, humming faintly as though filled with static. He could not shake the belief that the sea was awake and listening. He walked slowly, boots crunching over frost, his fingers tracing the ribbon that lay tied around the shell's narrow base. When he reached the bluff, he stopped. Below him, the water was dark glass, unbroken. For the first time in months, it did not roar. It waited. He spoke aloud, though his voice shook. "Clara," he said, "I hear you. Tell me what you need." The stillness answered first, then a faint ripple disturbed the surface far below. From that movement rose a sound, soft laughter, now layered. No longer only the child's, but something deeper, more knowing. He stepped back, shaken. "What are you?" he whispered. But no answer came, only the sound fading into the depth, leaving a void heavier than silence. That night, Doyle returned to the church and began a sermon to no audience. He spoke to the walls, to the pews, to the unseen thing that had blurred the border between mourning and belief. "We are creatures of noise," he said. "We whisper our grief to empty air, hoping it returns as comfort. But sometimes something does answer, and we call it mercy when maybe it is hunger." The words chilled him even as he spoke them. He looked again at the shell resting by the candlelight. Its surface glimmered faintly, pulsing as if alive. The laughter had quieted, replaced by a rhythmic thrum like a heartbeat. He wanted to smash it, throw it into the fire, but his hands refused. Instead, he set it carefully on the altar and leaned his forehead against the cold wood. As he knelt there, the door creaked open behind him. He turned sharply, expecting emptiness. But standing in the doorway was old Captain Lorne, his face pale with fatigue. "You haven't been seen in days," the captain said carefully. "The town thinks you've lost your mind." Doyle gave a faint laugh, brittle as glass. "Perhaps I have." Lorne's eyes shifted toward the altar. "What's that in your hand?" "The only thing that speaks to me anymore," Doyle said, and lifted the shell slightly. "She's in there, Lorne. I hear her still." The captain hesitated. "You need to end it. Whatever it is, throw it back." Doyle shook his head. "If I do, she'll be gone, completely. That's what death means, Reverend. You should know that better than anyone." Silence stretched between them, long and raw. At last, Doyle asked softly, "What if she's not the one haunting me? What if I'm haunting her, refusing to let her rest?" Lorne looked at him with quiet pity. "Then have mercy on her soul." That night, Doyle carried the shell back to the cliffs. The wind had stilled again, and the sea mirrored the faint moonlight. He stood at the edge, the same place where Clara had last been seen. "You were loved," he whispered. That should have been enough. He lifted the shell, hesitated, and then threw it far into the water. It struck the surface with a strange clarity, ringing like a distant bell before vanishing beneath. For a moment there was nothing, no sound, no movement, then the faintest ripple spreading outward like breath. The sea began to stir again, gentle, almost grateful. When Doyle turned to leave, he thought he heard something behind him, a final laugh, soft and fleeting, carried upward by the wind before dissolving into the night. By dawn, the fog had lifted. The town awoke to calm air, to sunlight breaking through clouds for the first time in months. Children played in the streets again. The fishermen prepared their boats, whispering that whatever curse had lingered was gone. Reverend Doyle never returned to Widow's Peak. His church remained empty, but for years after, townsfolk said that on certain quiet mornings, when the sea was calm enough to reflect the world perfectly, you could hear laughter drift across the water, faint, fragile, and free. Spring crept into Widow's Peak slowly, dragging warmth behind it like a reluctant truth. The snow melted from the cliffs first, seeping into the stone, until the earth softened enough to breathe again. The townspeople spoke less of ghosts now. The storms were milder, the sea quiet. Reverend Doyle had left behind more questions than anyone wanted to answer, yet his absence allowed the town to exhale. The Whitby house remained empty, its windows shuttered, a relic no one dared to claim. Children who passed by ran faster near its gate, as if the salt air still remembered Clara's laughter. By late May, one man did return to that house, Thomas Bray, a carpenter from Portland, hired to prepare it for sale. He arrived with lumber, nails, and little belief in the tales he had heard. "Haunted, they say," he murmured, shouldering open the warped front door. Inside, the air was dense, untouched for years. Dust hung in columns of golden light, and faint tide sounds pressed against the silence like a memory knocking to be let in. He set to work repairing the window frames first. But as he hammered, something shifted above him. Wood creaking where no weight should have been. He froze. It came again, light and deliberate, as if small feet crossed the upper floor. "Birds," he muttered to himself, forcing a laugh. Yet the sound continued, a rhythm too steady for wings. It stopped only when he called out, "Is someone there?" Silence answered, thick and unmoving. That evening he lit a small fire in the hearth to warm his supper. As the flames caught, he saw something beside the mantel, a small, dusty object that shimmered faintly when the firelight reached it, a seashell, smooth and pale, with the faint marking of a red ribbon around its base. He frowned, picking it up. The ribbon had frayed nearly to dust. More curious than afraid, he lifted the shell to his ear, smiling at the childish impulse. And then he heard it, soft and bright, a girl's giggle woven through the distant roar of waves. He dropped the shell instantly, but its laughter continued, faintly reverberating through the floorboards before fading altogether. The fire crackled louder. For the first time he noticed the faint scent of salt in the air, fresh and sharp, despite the miles between the house and the water. That night, Thomas could not bring himself to sleep inside. He set his bedding near the door, a hammer within arm's reach. Sometime after midnight a noise stirred him awake, a muffled knock, slow and rhythmic, coming from beneath the floor. He held his breath. 3 knocks, each softer than the last. Then a whisper, childlike, almost curious, right against the wood beneath him. "Who's there?" he stammered, voice catching. The silence that followed was so perfect it felt alive. Then came the faintest laughter, light as wind, drifting through the cracks in the floor before dissolving into nothing. When morning came, the seashell was gone. Thomas packed what little he had and walked to the harbour to find Captain Lorne. The old man listened quietly while Thomas recounted every sound, every detail. When the carpenter reached the part about the laughter, Lorne's expression hardened. He looked out at the grey water and sighed. "It's her," he said. "The child of Widow's Peak. She's been waiting." "Waiting for what?" Thomas asked. "For those who forget," the captain murmured. "She doesn't mean harm. She just wants to be remembered." Thomas shook his head. "I can't stay in that house." "It isn't right." "No," Lorne agreed. "It was never right after she was taken." He looked toward the horizon where the sea breathed gently against the rocks. "Best thing you can do is leave her be. Let her laughter stay where it belongs." By evening, Thomas had left Widow's Peak without a word. Others came after him to finish the work, yet the same pattern repeated. Tools misplaced, the faint sound of a child laughing when no one was near, water stains appearing overnight on the ceiling. Each worker left sooner than planned. The Whitby house remained unsold. Years later, the story of the laughing child became folklore told by sailors to ward off bad luck. They said if you ever heard laughter across calm water, you should close your eyes and stand still, because it was her, still playing near the edge where innocence met the sea. They said it wasn't sorrow that kept her there, but memory, the kind too deep for oceans to bury, and so Widow's Peak endured, bound to its past, the waves forever whispering the same echo, a child's laugh, bright and distant, echoing through the marrow of the cliffs. No one saw her again, but those who lingered long enough near the edge swore that when the wind shifted just right, you could still hear it, light, fleeting, like the breath of a ghost too young to know she was gone. Decades passed, and Widow's Peak aged quietly, its cliffs slowly eroding into the grey water below. The world beyond the harbour modernized. Trains came, electricity hummed through richer towns, but here time seemed to move slower, stubborn against progress. Fishermen still rose before dawn. Fog still rolled in without warning. What changed most was memory. The people grew new names, new worries, and little by little, the old stories faded into whispers, told to frightened children. Only the oldest among them recalled the name Whitby, or the reverend who had vanished into mist. Yet even stripped of names, the tale persisted, like the sea itself, reshaping but never disappearing. In the summer of 1921, a young teacher named Ellen Carter arrived from Boston to take charge of Widow's Peak's small coastal schoolhouse. She was practical, intelligent, and half-mocking of superstition. The sea, she said, was science, not spirit, tides and wind, not ghosts. On her first evening, the innkeeper warned her to keep her shutters closed after dusk. Ellen smiled politely but ignored him. She found comfort in the soft rhythm of the waves outside her window. The sound reminded her of her childhood summers on the Cape, of laughter echoing from the shore. But on the third night, that laughter changed. It came faintly at first, high, melodic, almost melodic enough to be mistaken for seabirds. Then it broke through the wind, too deliberate, too human, a child's laugh carried from nowhere. Ellen froze at her writing desk, pen half lifted. The sound lingered, light and joyful, ending as suddenly as it began. She waited, holding her breath. When silence finally returned, her candle had burned itself low. She mentioned it casually at the school the next morning, half expecting the children to laugh. Instead, the room grew tense. One boy, small, freckled, serious beyond his years, raised his hand. "It's the girl," he said. "The one who plays near the cliffs." Ellen frowned. "What girl?" "Do they call her Clara?" another child said quietly. "She laughs when the sea is calm. Mama says not to answer her if you hear her call." Ellen smiled patiently. Old stories then. But that night she dreamed of a house she had never seen, a lonely structure draped in ivy, windows wet with ocean mist. Inside, someone hummed softly, and a child's silhouette spun near the hearth. When Ellen woke, her pillow was damp and the smell of salt water clung to her hair. Days slipped by uneventfully, yet she couldn't forget the laughter. It came again a week later, clearer this time from the direction of the cliffs beyond the schoolhouse. She followed the sound until twilight, her shoes sinking into wet sand. There at the water's edge, she saw small footprints leading into the tide, fading as the waves crept higher. The sea was calm, glass-like, reflecting the last light of the sun. And just as she turned back, she heard it again, laughter this time behind her, light and close. She spun around, heart hammering, but there was only empty air and the endless hush of the ocean. Ellen returned to the inn, shaken yet fascinated. Over the next few weeks, she began researching the town's records, spending late hours in the rectory archives, an unused building kept locked but not abandoned. The caretaker allowed her inside, and there she found a dusty journal, its ink faded but legible, the writing of Reverend Doyle. Its opening page read, "The child laughs still. The sea has her, but she is not lost." Ellen read every entry, her skepticism giving way to a strange empathy for the tormented man. His last entry chilled her. It spoke of returning a seashell to the sea, of hearing laughter freed at last. The following morning, Ellen hiked to Widow's Peak with the journal in tow. The wind was low, the sky shining clear as glass. She stood at the edge where the cliffs dropped into eternity and called softly, "Clara." The sea remained still for a moment, then rippled faintly, as though something deep beneath stirred. She waited, listening, then smiled, half in disbelief, half in awe, as faint laughter drifted back to her, bright and childlike. She didn't run. Instead, she whispered, "Rest now." For the first time in decades, the air felt warm along the cliff's edge. The sound faded slowly, carried away with the wind, dissolving into the rhythm of the tide. When Ellen returned to town, she locked the journal in a drawer. She never spoke of what she had heard. But neighbors said that afterward the nights grew quieter. The laughter stopped, and the sea regained its voice, no longer eerie, no longer mournful. Years later, when Ellen Carter passed away, the innkeeper found the journal among her things, wrapped in a strip of red ribbon. And though no one dared read it aloud, some said that on calm nights when the moon hung low over Widow's Peak, the cliffs seemed to sigh, a faint echo of a child's joy forever carried by the sea. By the late 1940s, Widow's Peak had folded into quiet obscurity. The fishing boats were fewer, the houses older, and the sea rougher with each passing year. Children still whispered the old story of the laughing child, but to them it was no more than legend, a tale to test courage on foggy nights. Few remembered Reverend Doyle or the Whitby name, yet time, relentless as the tide, never truly erases what it only buries. One winter morning, a storm unlike any in memory tore through the coast. Waves hurled themselves against the cliffs, chewing at the foundation of the old Whitby house that miraculously still stood. The building had become abandoned again after multiple failed attempts at renovation, its warped roof and skeletal beams now battered by wind. Caught within that storm was a journalist named Henry Lowell, sent from Portland to cover the damage along the northern shoreline. Forced to seek shelter, he found himself at the gates of Widow's Peak, just as thunder split the horizon. He spotted the house through the mist, a shape half consumed by ivy, its windows glowing faintly as lightning struck behind it. Thinking someone might still live there, he fought his way up the muddy path and pushed through the front door. Inside was all ruin and silence, except for the distant whistle of wind threading through the cracked walls. Yet strangely, the fire in the stone hearth burned low, steady and warm, as though waiting for him. He called out. No answer. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots. On the mantel above the fading fire rested a small object, gleaming wet under the flicker of the flames. A seashell, smooth and white, rimmed faintly with what looked like dried salt. Henry picked it up curiously, rolling it in his palm. When he brought it closer to his ear, he heard what anyone might expect at first, a faint roar of the ocean trapped within. But nestled deep beneath that sound, lighter than a breath, came a brief, unmistakable laugh. Her child's. Startled, he lowered the shell. His rational mind supplied convenient explanations. The storm's pressure, the echo of wind, perhaps even his imagination heightened by exhaustion. Still, when he set the shell down again, it slid slightly on its own, leaving a thin trail of moisture across the stone. He stepped back, the fire popped. Behind him a door creaked open, not by wind but slowly, deliberately. Through the narrow gap spilled a soft blue-grey light, calmer than the storm outside. Henry hesitated, then lifted his lantern and stepped forward. The air within the next room smelled faintly of seaweed and smoke. In the center stood a small wooden chair overturned, beside a child's shoe no bigger than a man's palm. He crouched to touch it and froze. From the far corner of the room, a quiet giggle drifted toward him. "Hello?" he called. The laughter came again, lilting, neither near nor distant. Every instinct screamed to flee, but he remained, curiosity stirring beneath fear. "Who's there?" he demanded, louder this time. The only reply was the creak of the wood and a faint tapping sound, 3 knocks against the floorboard, gentle but measured. Tap, tap, tap. The pattern repeated, then stopped. When he looked closer, damp rings bloomed beneath the wood, spreading outward like ripples. Lightning illuminated the room once more. For an instant he saw her, the outline of a girl standing by the doorway, bare feet glistening, hair curling against translucent shoulders. She smiled faintly before fading again into shadow. Henry stumbled backward, heart hammering. He left the house without his coat, braving rain and wind until he reached the harbor by dawn. The fisherman found him shivering beside a shuttered boathouse, mumbling about a child in the storm. When asked what he had seen, he only said, "She laughed." Days later, when the storm finally quieted, the townsfolk climbed the cliffs to check the damage. The Whitby house was gone. Every beam and shingle had been swept into the sea. Yet among the scattered debris, they found one object resting intact on the rocks below. A single seashell tied with the faint remnant of a red ribbon. The townspeople buried it atop the bluff beside the old church ruins, marking the spot with a wooden cross. They said a prayer none of them truly believed, and left flowers wrapped in coarse linen. The sea was calm that evening, too calm, reflecting the last glow of the sunset like sheets of molten glass. As darkness fell, one fisherman lingered at the edge of the cliff, listening to the slow rhythm of the tide below. Then he heard it, a soft laugh floating through the air. It wasn't mocking or eerie this time. It was peaceful, almost grateful. He removed his cap and bowed his head. By morning, the sound was gone, and the sea remained silent for years afterward. Widow's Peak settled into its final quiet, a town defined not by tragedy, but by the small mercy of memory. For those who still remembered the tale, they said the laughing child had finally gone home. Her laughter folded into the waves that once called her name. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.